Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast, where we talk about everything related to language learning. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today is our guest, Crush, aka Chicken Guy or Chicken Dude. He's a longtime friend of mine and a polyglot with an interest in minority and lesser studied languages. He also runs HypLern, where you can learn languages with bilingual texts. All right, and Crush, welcome. It's good to finally put a face to the name or the names. I think I've known you by like three different names over the years
Yeah,
across various language learning things.
I think for languages I've mostly used Crush. So,
I think
but
on Memrise and maybe
yeah, Memrise I have
on
Chicken
GitHub
Dude, I
you have
think.
Chicken Guy and Chicken Dude.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to the people who may not know who you are? Tell them a little about
Uh,
your background in the language community, as well as your background with languages.
sure. So I'm Crush. I got started in my first language a long time ago in middle school. We did 3 years of Latin, and I thought that was the coolest thing ever. I never really expected to speak a foreign language, but I just loved Latin. I thought it was really cool. And when I was maybe 11, we went to Germany once, and that was my first experience meeting people that didn't speak English all the time. And after that, I really wanted to learn German. So that was my second language in high school. I did 3 years of German. And it's kind of funny. I guess the languages that I studied in school are probably the languages I'm the weakest in. But after German, I started with Spanish um, using Platiquemos, which is still my favorite course ever. And after about a
It's one of
year
my
of,
favorites too.
oh, it's great.
Yeah,
Um,
if all self-study courses could be as in-depth as Platychemos, we would have an army of fluent people. I
yeah,
will say
so
it didn't really cover the two forms. Um, so at the time when I did Platychemos, I didn't supplement it with immersion like I should have. So I showed up in Mexico quite competent at outputting with a very narrow range of vocab and
yeah,
absolutely no command of the two form.
so for me, I did Platiquemos for about 9 months, I guess.
Mhm.
And then I went to Spain and I lived in Spain for 2 years. And
You lived in
uh,
Basque Country, right?
yeah, that was later.
Later,
I
okay.
didn't, when I got to Spain, I didn't realize that people spoke anything other than Spanish there. And that was kind of what opened my eyes to non larger languages, I guess. Um, but I got there and it took me about a week, I guess, just speaking with people before I felt comfortable. Um, and then after that, when I was in Spain, I read a lot. I probably read like a book every 2 or 3 days. I'd spend basically all of my money at the secondhand bookshops that have like 50-cent books, and I just buy 10 of them or something. And so I read very intensively, and I did intensive reading for the first like 5 or 6 books. So I noted down every single word that I didn't know. And then I looked it up and I made word lists and I tried, um, I guess it was mostly word lists that I used, the Iverson style word list, if anybody's familiar. And then
The
while I
Iverson
was,
style word list. We'll have to put that in the box. I forget the description box below, because so the Iverson word list method. Iverson is a Danish polyglot who's also an old head, as we say. He's sort of been in the scene for many many years. He was an old head when I came onto the scene like 13 years ago,
yeah,
back on the How to Learn Any Language forums.
yeah, that's where I learned about him. And I picked up a lot of good advice, like when I was getting started learning languages. And while I was in Spain, I started French and German. Initially, I wanted to do basically the main languages. I wanted to do French, German, Spanish, and then
Like
I also
figs,
wanted to do
basically.
Russian. Basically figs, but replacing Italian with Russian.
Okay.
And in Spain, I did the FSI courses for French and German intensively. So that was when I still had a lot of energy. I did about 3 hours a day of each of FSI
Different
on
when you're
top of,
old.
yeah. And when I first got there, um, I wasn't working, but then I started teaching English. And when I taught English, I walked to all of my classes. I didn't have money for a bus or anything. So when I was walking to class, I would do FSI. So it would take me like 40 minutes to walk to the different students' classes. So I'd have 40 minutes going to class 1, another 40 minutes to class 2, and so on. So I had a lot of just downtime that I used for FSI. And
So when it comes to your language background, I know that Cole, aka Hulk, for those of you who know him from the Discord, praises your Spanish. So Cole went to school in Spanish, did a higher degree in Spanish, and speaks quite good Spanish. And for him to say that you're better than him is quite the praise, I think. And I know that you're very humble, so that's okay. But in addition to Spanish, you have quite the repertoire of languages, and not only is it a wide repertoire, it's a deep repertoire. So you get beyond the basics. So in addition to Spanish, German, French, you've also got Basque. Notably, you mod a Basque server. You lived in Basque country. I believe you've got some degree of competency in Mandarin and Cantonese. Japanese is your white whale, if I understand it. It's the one that you've struggled with the most. You hate the writing
yeah,
system and a whole bunch of other nitpicks with the language. And you're also the Kichwa guy. You you have this project of Kichwa conversations where I don't know, you sort of helped build 100 transcribed Kichwa conversations with audio for the Kichwa learning community.
yeah.
And in
Yeah,
addition to all that, you've also built a whole bunch of cool tools over the years. So you're sort of a programmer. So you've built tools to repurpose audio courses like Glossica. You built Nativo, and a whole bunch of stuff. You used to help maintain courses on Memrise. You've sort of given a whole bunch to the community over the past. How long have you been language learning? 15 years.
I started Spanish, I think, in 2007.
Okay.
So, yeah, since about 2007. And yeah, a lot of my languages are more passive. The languages that I speak the best are generally the ones that had FSI courses.
Because you could drill
So,
the output.
yeah, so Spanish and Mandarin are probably my strongest languages. And then Basque is pretty decent. And I also really enjoyed Esperanto, but I haven't used that quite as much in the past few years.
Do
But
you
I've
think that
been
having lived in Spain and having lived in China affected your output ability in those languages and as to why they're so strong?
absolutely. So for me, in Spain, I was basically, I guess in both places. In Spain, I was in a monolingual Spanish environment, and in uh, China, after the first 3 years, I was in a monolingual. Basically, everything was in Mandarin. For the first 3 years, it was mostly English for me. After about 2 years, my Mandarin started to get to the point where it was strong enough that it was easier for me to talk with my friends in Mandarin than English. So between years 2 and 3, things started to shift to Mandarin. And then by the time I left, it was basically 100% Mandarin. So even
what has kept you in the language learning game so long? Since 2007, it's now 2023.
I guess I think at some point I stopped learning languages because of some sort of usefulness that I saw in them. I just fell in love with languages and language learning in general. And then there were just, I'd hear about a language that, for me, I really got interested in kind of marginalized languages. Languages which, like Basque, I guess, for Basque and Catalan, they had kind of rougher histories, and that's, I don't know, as somebody's like in Spanish, more of like an acrata, like kind of interested in like communities, taking care of communities versus individuals. Like really got into these kind of regional languages, and I think that's kind of what really drove my interest. I'd pick up a larger language. Like for me, learning Mandarin led me into Cantonese and Shanghainese, and learning Spanish led me into Basque and Catalan and Galician. And Spanish also led me into Quechua on the other side of the ocean. But I don't know. I've just got these.
So, regarding the sort of marginalized languages, would you what do you feel about like learning them versus learning sort of a high support language? So languages that have support at, say, the national level or at the international level, things like Spanish versus, say, Quechua.
So
I feel like a lot of refolders learn languages that are like national languages that have a lot of support. And it's a totally different ballgame, I imagine, learning something like Quechua.
Yeah. So in my mind, I forget if this is something I heard from somebody, but I mean, if you learn a language with 100 million speakers versus a language with 100 speakers, in the end, like in English, I maybe talk with 10 people, 10 different people over the course of a month. I have like 10 main people. There's really just, I really just need one or two people, like one or two friends to really make the language worthwhile. So whenever I meet somebody that speaks another language, it's always a really strong temptation to try to learn their language, especially if they speak a language which is lesser studied, not like Quechua across the different dialects has like 6 million speakers. It's not a small language, but it's not something that you're going to really find
16
online.
million, right? Not 6 million.
Maybe I've focused on Southern Quechua, which I think is
here.
Yeah,
like we tend to call these small languages in the language learning community, but we really mean lesser studied. Let's see here. How many speakers in Quechua? Okay, yeah, you're right. It's about 8 to 10 million speakers if you include the whole sort of dialect cluster.
Yeah, so Southern Quechua is mostly mutually intelligible, but you have Southern, Central, and Northern. Those are Northern and Southern, oddly enough, are closer to each other, but the Central Quechua is completely
Vietnamese
unintelligible.
is the same way. Central Vietnamese in the mountains is very divergent versus the lowland dialects in the north and the south.
Yeah.
So learning these languages, with Kichwa, we've talked about this. You've had to get into like folk stories and folk songs, and then you've also had to pay and make your own graded material because there just isn't a lot out there to get a footing in the language.
Yeah. I guess that's another thing that kind of inspires me is being able to make resources. Like for Basque, I had the first 2000 sentences of the Classica course translated, and I wanted to get them recorded as well, but by the time I had them translated, I didn't really need them anymore. Just it's also interesting for these smaller languages. I'm sure you know Alan R. King is a big linguist in Basque, and he also was kind of a promoter of, I think he called them tiny languages or something, but he made a bunch of really high quality resources for learning Basque, and on top of that, they're in English. So I think the best courses aren't always for the largest languages. Like Asimil has the Catalan course, which Catalan isn't really a small language. You can go to Barcelona and find people who speak it all over. But sometimes these smaller languages have people creating kind of more passionate projects. And that's something I've seen in Quechua, in Basque, in Catalan.
How about
And
Filipino, which is not a small language, but I feel like there are quite a few passion projects for Tagalog out there.
yeah, so Tagalog is one of the biggest surprises for me. I wasn't expecting there to be such high quality resources to learn it, but there's
Tagalog.com,
Tagalog.com
learningtagalog.com.
and learningtagalog.com were the two things that just completely surprised me. So
If every language had a dictionary like Tagalog.com, fluency would be inevitable for most people.
yep. So I'm trying to get something similar like that for Hawaiian. But
Yeah. Now, you got a lot of these different projects. So you've got, I don't know if it's HypLern or HypLern.
it's HypLern, but
HypLern. And then I guess you're working on sort of well, I don't know if it's you, but you and your circle of people are working on a Hawaiian sort of assisted reader, like a link type thing.
yeah, it's mostly my wife. She's been doing it as a sort of practice project, and I told her to make a practice project that I'm going to use. And
Okay.
I've been kind of making an Android version of it. So
All right. Very cool. Now, regarding your Tagalog journey, I used to tell people that you got very good without doing any flashcards. Because when you started Tagalog, you didn't use flashcards. But I think at some point you must have changed because we were talking the other day and you mentioned that you've started using flashcards. You do like 15 a day in Filipino.
no, I do 15 reviews altogether. It's
Okay.
about 5 new
Okay.
cards. Um, at So in the beginning, all of the words that I was picking up were pretty high frequency,
Mhm.
and it got to a point where I'd have maybe, according to Tagalog.com, it'd be like 97% comprehension. And the words that I was coming across, I would see once or twice, maybe throughout 2 or 3 books that I'd read. So I've kind of slowly gone basically where if I've seen a word maybe 3 or 4 times and I don't remember it, then I'll just add it to Anki. And I've been adding them just as sentence cards, which are easier for me to recall. There's more context behind them.
Do you mine them directly from Tagalog.com?
I mine them from books. So I made a script basically where take the new words from Tagalog.com, which has the word and the definition, and I pass in the word that I'm learning, and then I paste in a sentence, and then it goes through a like a TTS, a text to speech, from Google to make a audio version of the sentence, just because it's more interesting, I guess. Even if the audio is really bad, it still feels less painful to go through them. But
Right. Interesting. So, yeah. So when did you
yeah,
start incorporating flashcards into your study? Because I'm
I
definitely guilty on this very podcast, having praised your progress in Tagalog over the course of about a year, from just
it was
reading to
after about a year. Yeah.
okay. Because
So
initially you
it's
had
been
this
like a
method
month maybe. Yeah.
where you would sort of take graded material and you would read it over and over. So the first time, the first pass might take you 30 minutes. Then you would read it again, it would take 10 minutes, and then again, it would take 5 minutes. So you still had repetition, but you were avoiding
Hmm.
flashcards. So you were just repeating sort of intensive reading.
Yep. That was when I was going through the conversations, which I think is the perfect size for reading something several times. It's like a 5 to 6 minute conversation. So it's maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages of text. And uh, I think that's probably my favorite way of building vocabulary. If I had interlinear text for everything, I would definitely prefer to do that. But I kind of felt like I wasn't picking up vocabulary as quickly as I was in the beginning because it was just getting to very low frequency vocab.
And outside of Esperanto, I guess Tagalog is the first language that you've learned that is majority non-native. So out of the 80 million speakers, only 30 million are native speakers of the language. What has that been like? Um,
It's been kind of interesting. For example, there's a Wattpad story that I looked at once, and the author wrote it in a mixture of Tagalog, Japanese, and English. And at the top, he had a note saying, "Please excuse the errors. I don't speak Tagalog natively, I don't speak English natively, and I don't speak Japanese." And I thought that was kind of an interesting choice. And Tagalog for me is something that usually I would have started Tagalog to get to as sort of a foothold into another language. Um,
hmm.
but the people that I know speak Tagalog natively, so that's it's kind of stopped there. Um,
Ethnic Tagalogs hit different when they speak Filipino. I had a roommate once who was a native speaker of the Southern dialect. Um, so he was from Laguna and ethnic Tagalog. And he pulled out words that were either native or descended from Malay, whereas somebody who learned it as a lingua franca might use the English or the Spanish. And I remember, in addition to grammatical differences, being hit by like all this obscure vocab, you know. Um, so, uh, yeah, he was my language partner. We met on a language exchange site, and we talked for about a year, and we decided to room together for a while. And one thing that's very interesting to me, having spoken Filipino for so long, is when I read Wattpad, which is, as we know, sort of the master library of Tagalog content. Uh, I can usually guess where the author is from, if they're a native Tagalog or not, based on how they phrase things, in terms of like affix usage, word usage, so on and so forth. And it's a very fun experience, I think.
yeah, I've done similar things with Spanish, trying to figure out where somebody's from by the words they use, or Like if you see Chilean slang or Peruvian slang or things like that, it's
Argentinian slang.
yep.
All right. So, yeah, I think you've wowed the Filipino community with your progress. Very dedicated. And you're sort of an anomaly because you don't live in the Philippines and you don't have any Filipino family, which, in my experience, tend to be the two biggest groups of Filipino learners. And here you
Yeah.
are in the south of the USA, just chugging away and making really good progress.
I guess for me, it wasn't a huge time commitment. It was for the first year, I guess it was about 30 to 60 minutes a day of. Initially, it was going through the Learning Tagalog course and then going through the conversations, which I've really come to enjoy those things. I used the Ali Richards has a set of Cantonese conversations, which I found out. I wish I knew that. I don't know what it was called then. Language Tools, Language IO, OP Lingo. It's had a bunch of different names, but
It's now called Language Crush,
Language.
unrelated to your name.
Yep. So every time I share the Quechua conversations, which I've uploaded there, people think it's my site, but I've in the past, I don't know, maybe 2 months, I guess, I've started trying to incorporate more audio immersion. I've also started doing meeting with a tutor, usually once or twice a week, trying to build some speaking ability, and that part has been going much more slowly than building reading comprehension.
Yeah. There's a lot to talk about in this podcast, and I don't want to isolate the listeners and just talk about Filipino because that's what I want to talk about. I could, but I don't want to do that. So I'm going to shift gears here, and I'm going to ask you. You have been involved in a lot of giving back to the community, with your projects, your GitHub stuff, managing community decks on Memrise, so on and so forth. One question that the community had for you was, if you had an infinite amount of money, how would you fund something for languages? What would you do? What would you build or have built?
So I would build two things for each language. I would build an FSI course for every single language. And I think I've talked about it with you before, but I really like Glossica and the conversations, the like Tagalog conversations or Cantonese conversations from Language Crush.
And to clear that up for people, Language Crush by Leo Smith. He has a series of usually about 100 conversations of just sort of like people talking. They're usually
Yep.
a couple minutes long over a
It's
variety of
usually
different
6
topics.
minutes. Yep. And they're transcribed and they're 100% free. So, but I'd love to kind of combine the two. Basically, you'd have something similar to Classica, which would also have grammar explanations for things, and you would have basically go through a set of sentences over the course of a week that would prepare you for a conversation. And then you'd listen to that conversation during the next week. You'd just review it and then learn the next week's sentences to prepare you for the next set of basically the next conversation. So I think it's a great way to build listening and speaking skills. Though my favorite course style of all is that drill-based FSI style course. So that would be my first choice.
I do not have the tolerance that I had for that 7 years ago when I did it with Spanish. 7 years ago, I was probably 100 pounds skinnier. I had a lot more energy, and I had a lot more tolerance for that sort of thing.
It's a
Now
big
I'm very
commitment.
now I'm very content to just grind vocab and memorize and read graded stuff until I get good.
So for me, it depends on my goals in the language. If I'm just going for passive skills, I would much rather just read. I'd rather go through Assimil and just kind of have fun with the language. But for me, Spanish and Mandarin, for example, Spanish was the first language that I really learned to fluency. So I really wanted I was really motivated. So I did about 3 hours a day of FSI, and then um, I would do some vocabulary study. I'd try to do language exchanges. I'd hang out on shared talk all day, and just try to
Now,
get as much
and
Spanish
I
as I
say that I
can.
don't have tolerance for this, and I'm actually kind of lying. I've been spending about 2 hours a day for the past month on Swahili, so doing memorize vocab, cramming vocab. So I guess I guess if the spark is still there, right? You find a language that really
Yep.
speaks to your soul.
And for me, the best part about these drill courses is you can do them outside. So I would go for long walks and get my exercise in for the day and learn a language. So
All right. Now let's see here. I want to see what the community had questions for you. So, oh, this is a good one. What is your advice on managing multiple languages? Because we've actually talked about this. So right now, um, I have been working on a schedule where I do Swahili in the morning, then I do Filipino in the evening, which is a lot easier. I just basically read. Um, but I have other languages that I would like to maintain. So right now, the only Spanish I use is when I do refunds or I help answer questions because I do the support for the Refold website. That's like the extent of my Spanish. I've sort of become like a heritage speaker. Like that's pretty much all I I do. It's a very narrow range of the language. I wouldn't really even call it maintenance. And I myself am curious, how do you maintain your sort of vast repertoire of languages?
So for some languages, like with my wife, we speak mostly Mandarin at home, with a mix of uh, Spanish, English, and Cantonese. But uh, for most of my languages, it's been kind of one of my biggest regrets. Once I get fairly decent at a language, it stops feeling like I'm working at it and I'm just enjoying it. And usually when I hit that point, like, okay, it's time to go to the next one. And then it kind of gets pushed to the side. So for me, Spanish has been a bit of an anomaly because I learned it, I feel like, to a relatively high level. I haven't used it very actively in probably 10 years, but I'll just, every once in a while, I'll come across a book that sounds interesting, or there'll be a show on Netflix
And
and
you,
we'll
with
watch that.
Spanish, you get into actual literature, so I'm kind of guilty of reading light novels and whatnot. But you get into like Cien años de soledad and things like that. Like you read actual literature.
So that was one of the biggest things that surprised me about Spanish is I just really fell in love with the classic literature in Spain. Well, in Spanish in general, but I've read of classic literature. I've read more Spanish authors, and in English, I didn't really enjoy very many older, like 1800 authors, other than Mark Twain. But in Spanish, I just really get pulled into all of those stories.
One of the funny things about Mark Twain, I, like you, used to be an English teacher. And I had a student come to me and say, I want to read the classics. Can you help me work through Mark Twain? And it'd probably been the first time in 20 years that I had looked at a Mark Twain book. And it was written in this sort of lower South, or sorry, upper South, lower Midwest variety of English. Um, and it was kind of hard to read even for a native. They sort of sounded like 1800s, Missouri people.
Yeah. So I guess for me, at some point, you just kind of get certain habits. Like for me, speaking Basque, I'm pretty active in the Basque Discord server that we have. So I answer a lot of questions. We'll talk in Basque, and I've got a lot of Basque books, and I've kind of regretted not really reading them since I've pretty decent at like everyday conversation, but starting to notice that reading literature is getting harder again when you get outside
Is
of
Basque
everyday
literature
domains.
in Standard Basque? Because Basque is one of those languages that's sort of like a dialect cluster that may not
Yeah, so
really be mutually intelligible, right?
yeah, so Standard Basque is kind of interesting because you've got this standardized language, but it's much broader. So depending on where the author's from, you might see more of this certain word, or like maybe some, especially when you get into like Ika, which is, it's basically a completely separate verb conjugation for speaking with somebody at a more familiar level. It's not the same thing, but it's kind of similar to that tu versus usted, which Basque doesn't really distinguish between. They've basically just got one U form, but there's a separate
Or
form
like some
that,
sort of like honorific type thing,
except it's kind
except it's
of
for
more,
familiarity.
yeah, but the way it's done is the entire verb system changes. So it's not just like you have a word for you and then a word for familiar you. Every single verb that you use changes,
Mhm.
and the way this is used differs somewhat between different dialects. And you can see some of those
It's
things
actually really
sometimes.
interesting, because it's interesting how languages across the world handle registers. So famously, Korean and Japanese have these honorific conjugations for verbs. Uh, and Javanese has a whole different set of vocab. They've got three levels depending on the familiarity and formality respect. Um, but in the Philippines, Bicol, for example, has an angry register where they have a whole separate set of vocab for being angry. Yeah.
Nice.
So like the normal word for dog would change to a whole unrelated word when you're angry, which is just, how does that happen? It's very interesting to me.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed just learning the ways languages express things in different ways. Like for Basque, I love the verb system. It's when you start learning Basque, you see this like chart of different ways you conjugate the verb, and it's like, I don't know, probably 1,000 different forms, but it's very regular and systematic. In Basque, the verb tells you, like for Spanish, you don't have to put the subject. You can just say like hablo, and you know that it's I speak. In Basque, it'll tell you the subject, the direct object, and the indirect object. That's all crammed into the verb. So you can say these
Interesting.
really interesting things in one word. Like,
Swahili, I don't know about the different types of objects, but Swahili has something similar where the verb conjugation contains the subject, the object, the tense slash aspect. Um,
yeah. And when I started learning Quechua, I noticed that Quechua has basically the same system as Basque. It's a little less developed, or there are fewer forms, but it's something that I wasn't expecting to see. And there you go.
How do you feel about the Filipino focus system or voice system, where
Yeah, that's one of
you
the
know
things that I really enjoyed about learning Tagalog. It was just a new way of seeing things that I hadn't seen before. And in a lot of ways, it kind of made me think of Basque because the verb tells you,
the verb
it
can
can
tell
tell
you
you
the
if it's like an indirect
reason,
object or, yeah, it has a lot of extra information that you don't have in English, for example. So,
and it sort of tells you information about the noun as well.
mhm.
So people tend to obsess over cases. They're like, oh, these cases are so cool. But Filipino sort of marks case on the verb. Like you've got a locative verb, right? And like
Yeah,
lagyan versus ilagay, right? So like lagyan would be locative. So that means that uh, the noun taking the ang case, right, would be sort of
yeah,
the location of the action. And there's something called reason voice, right? Like where the reason or the because, the why, is baked into the verb. Um, and one thing that gets a lot of people when they come to Austronesian languages is it kind of feels like the whole language is spoken in the passive from an English speaker point of view. You
yeah.
know,
That was one thing that took a while to wrap my head around, is like the concept of, well, basically what the ang is. Like initially it was just the in my head. That's how I would translate it. And it took a while to figure out, just basically you've got the different parts. I think in learning Tagalog they're talking about like you've got the nung, and then you've got like the sa stuff. So just learning how those worked was one of the initial difficulties that really tripped me up.
so yeah, you have a lot of meta-linguistic awareness because you've sort of studied so many different languages over the past since it's 2007.
Yeah, and with Basque, for example, uh, the way you do relative clauses is very similar to the way they're done in Mandarin. So I think a lot of people have struggled with that, whereas I didn't struggle with it in Basque. I struggled with it in Mandarin when I first came across. Like you'd have, uh, I saw that man. Like instead of saying the man that I saw, it'd have like I saw Wakanda the nigger. And then Basque basically does the exact same thing.
So when you learn one thing and it's similar in another language, it carries over.
Yeah, even if the words are different or they're used slightly differently, sometimes it's just easier to wrap your mind around it. And I guess for me, after learning Spanish, before I learned Spanish and was able to feel comfortable speaking with people and reading and understanding things in Spanish, I didn't really think it was possible to learn a language and really internalize it. But once I realized that you just kind of take it through, you have to go through, uh, just realize that it eventually leads to where you're trying to get to. Um, things don't make sense in the beginning, but 2 months later, they just suddenly make sense. So that was one of the things that really helped me with later languages, is just realizing that it's not going to make sense right now, but if you don't stop, it'll eventually make sense.
And one thing that I really like in terms of learning multiple languages is shared vocabulary. Um, you know, how do you feel your languages have interacted with each other in terms of vocab? So, like obviously with Filipino, there's a whole bunch of Spanish loans. Um, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So for me, that's what made French and Italian more difficult because, well, and the same with Portuguese. I felt like I knew so much of the language already that I didn't really feel that motivated to put much effort into it. So
Your Portuguese is funny. I remember talking to you one time, and you were looking for Dune in Spanish. And I think you unintentionally bought the Portuguese audiobook and you said, frick it, I'm going to just listen to it. And you you listened to Dune, I think, in Portuguese unintentionally.
yeah, so Portuguese has been a weird one. I've really enjoyed it. There have been a lot of, especially from Brazil, there are a lot of content creators that I've find their stuff really interesting. They have a lot of interesting projects. I see Brazilians all over in like Discord servers I'm in forums I'm in. It seems like my
They're a big
interests
country.
in there. Yeah, I think a lot of Brazilians have similar interests to me.
I
But
tell you, the real
just
content in Portuguese is Angola and Mozambique. You know,
well, the other thing is there's a big Esperanto movement in Brazil. So when I was really working on Esperanto, I speak with a lot of people from Brazil. But
I was watching something about native Esperanto speakers, and they included 2 children who were from Brazil in
yeah,
the documentary.
yeah, I've watched a couple of those, and it's interesting to see the way that the children view the language. Like if I forget what like one of the examples was one of the kids forgot the word for like to go to the bathroom, and the word they used was malmanji. It's like mal is to do the opposite.
Reverse eat.
Manji, yeah. So it's like to reverse eat was how they said to go to the bathroom. So
Mhm. Man, I tell you, you have had quite the journey when it comes to language stuff. Um, so what is your how would you advise someone learning tone? That's one of the questions the community had for you, being that you are competent in Mandarin and to Cantonese, or in Cantonese to some degree. What would your take there be for acquiring tone?
So, what I've recommended to everybody who's asked me about Mandarin pronunciation in general is to do the first 2 units. I think it's the first 2 units of the FSI course
FSI.
in Mandarin. It basically drills the pronunciation. It tells you where your tongue, what position your tongue should be in. And after I did that, I couldn't speak Mandarin well at all, but I would always get comments on my pronunciation that say your Mandarin is very broken, but it sounds really good. So I think FSI really gives you a lot of work drilling
I
the
think essentially
tones.
you should drill tones.
Yep, I I
And your
would just
method,
use the course
well,
from FSI.
method
So
is not totally vanilla refold, right? Because you don't stray away from textbooks or traditional grammar study type stuff like drills.
yeah, I really enjoy grammar. So my general method that I've used is hit grammar hard in the beginning. Um, Generally, over the course of like maybe 6 months to a year, I'll hit grammar really hard, pick up the first 1 to 2,000 words, and then while I'm doing that, I'll also try to find ways to use the language, whether that's speaking with people or reading. And then once I feel comfortable with the grammar, I just basically spend as much time as I can listening, reading, watching, speaking.
So how how does content compare across languages? So uh, I'm most familiar with Filipino, given that a lot of content is like amateur, amateur books from Wattpad, amateur stuff on YouTube, um, versus like well polished classic literature from, say, Spanish. How does that compare? Like, I imagine it's different. I'm sort of dipping my toes into Africa right now, and I'm curious as to see what sort of content I'll get into.
Yeah. So definitely for Spanish, there is a plethora of choices. You have a variety of different, uh, even different continents, different countries that you can pick from, and there's so much interesting stuff. For Tagalog, it's been a bit different. I've struggled to find some captivating stories at times, but at the same time,
There are so many. I mean, there's
yeah,
actually a whole bunch to read in Tagalog. Um, when I was looking at like Swahili stuff, I found like 200 books or so um, that were translated, and I found a couple of stories on Wattpad, but it's not a whole bunch compared to, say, Filipino, where you open up Wattpad and there's thousands of pages of different books to read.
yeah. One of the things that surprised me was Basque has a very strong amount of literature. I think maybe Spanish people in general are very fond of
I think they're
reading.
very, yeah, because I've seen a whole bunch of Catalan literature as well.
Yep. So Basque and Catalan have a very strong literary tradition, and for both of those, I've never really run out of things to read. In Mandarin, I really struggled to find content that captivated me. I ended up watching a lot of wuxia dramas, and that was the closest to uh,
Captivating
like
content.
something I could binge on. But for literature, I didn't find a whole lot that really grabbed me. I liked
That's
uh,
interesting.
I liked
Because I
Sanma's
feel
stuff.
I
She
feel
had
like a
a
lot of people are very into the Chinese web novels. You know,
Yeah, and I could never really get into it. For Cantonese, I feel like the cinema for Cantonese is very good, and I've really enjoyed watching uh, just a lot of police shows and kung fu films and those sorts of things. I really,
now, in addition to films and reading books, for the languages that have it, you do other things as well. Like, you recommended Fire Emblem to me, and I had no
mm,
clue that Fire Emblem had so much dialogue. I actually played through one of the ones on the Game Boy Advance in
yeah,
Spanish, and I was very pleasantly surprised by the amount of dialogue. It kind of felt like I was reading a book.
yeah. So I'm a big fan of JRPGs. That was really the inspiration for me to learn Japanese. I wanted to be able to play video games and convince myself that I was studying. And um, a lot of my favorite JRPGs, like Legend of Legaia and Final Fantasy VII or Chrono Trigger, I've played these languages in other languages that I was studying, like Spanish. Well, I've played pretty much all of them in Spanish, some of them in French, German, Italian, basically the FIGS languages, which were the easiest to find. Um, and yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to find content for especially larger languages. But even again, Basque has dubs of a lot of my favorite cartoons as a kid. I watched Scooby Doo in Basque. I watched Avatar. I watched Rugrats in Basque. That was a lot of my early immersion in Basque. Was just cartoons that I watched as a kid.
Yeah, it's very interesting how well supported stuff is in Spanish regional languages.
Yeah,
Um, there's Dragon Ball Z in Galician, for example.
yeah,
So that's, very interesting. Because I
yeah,
think people
and
going into a language that has like like a million speakers or something, they don't expect there to be a lot of content. Because interestingly enough, what I have noticed over the years is that speaker size has absolutely frick all to do with content availability. There are regional languages in China, India, the Philippines with 300, with 30 million speakers, 50 million
Yeah.
speakers that have less content than something like Norwegian with 5 million speakers. So it really has very little to do with population size.
Yeah, and as I said before, you really just need a handful of people to make the language come alive for you. It's definitely much easier with Quechua. It's been difficult. I've had to go to resources that I would not normally go to, and in the end, I've ended up.
Is that stuff like missionary stuff?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I've had people approach me in an official capacity for like Refold coaching, and it's like, oh, I'm learning Ojibwe, and I'm like, man, I'm gonna have to say like folk tales, but also like Jehovah's Witnesses, Watchtower. They translate
Yeah.
Watchtower into Ojibwe. I mean, you got to take what you can.
Or find a way to make it yourself, which
you have done.
I've been lucky for Shanghainese. I was lucky to find someone that would help me translate.
Spec.
Yeah, I've had them translate the Mandarin sentences from Classica into Shanghainese, and they did that very cheaply.
Because you speak Mandarin, you're also able to use Mandarin language sources to, you've got a couple of, I think, Shanghainese from Mandarin textbooks.
Yeah. And I guess what else? We've had people do similar things for HypLern. We've had them write stories for us in Basque and Quechua, and I've been trying to use that. Basically, the money that would come in from that would be used for paying for translators and also for creating content, especially for smaller languages like
You
Quechua
sort of,
and Basque.
you and your business partner use sort of the popular languages, FIGs and such, to fund
and
smaller
surprisingly
languages.
enough, Dutch has been one of the largest sellers for us.
Interesting. Is that because your business partner is Dutch, or is it
I don't know.
some other reason?
I wonder if interlinear texts are just more popular among Dutch learners, but generally the top sellers are like Dutch, Spanish, and French.
Very cool. Now, Crush, we're about at time, but before we go, anything you want to say? Any takeaways? Any words of wisdom? Any parting words?
Sure. For me, I would say if it's available, if you have an FSI basic course in your language and you can dedicate 2 hours a day to it, I would say go for it. It'll be, if your goal is to speak, don't be afraid of drills. Also, when you go to get away from the larger languages, or more commonly studied languages, you get into a kind of a more personal area. So when I would go for language exchanges in Quechua or Basque, things would start out in Spanish or English, and then the moment that you switch to Quechua or to Basque, they basically just say, oh, I'm going to teach you Quechua, I'm going to teach you Basque, you need to learn this language. They just get really excited. And that's probably been one of the driving things behind my journey, is just feeling, I don't know, there's that Gandhi quote where you speak to someone in a language they know. Yeah. And then
their brain.
Once you get to
their language, you speak to
their
heart.
language, it's reaching their heart. And you can definitely feel this when you, especially in bilingual, trilingual, or multilingual communities, once you speak to somebody in the language that they grew up speaking, something switches, something changes, and it's really gratifying. It's really great to feel that. So don't be afraid to, even if you don't have, I don't know, Netflix in that language, it's going to be rewarding in other ways. So.
All right. And thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.